It started with a phone call I never thought I'd get from my own father. "Emma," he said, his voice steady and cold. "We all talked about it, and we agreed you're not invited to Thanksgiving this year." At first I thought I misheard. I even laughed softly, waiting for him to say it was a joke. But then I heard my brother's laughter in the background, followed by my sister-in-law's snide little chuckle and the clinking of glasses. I waited for my mother's voice, hoping she'd say something, anything to stop this humiliation. But all I got was silence. Long, heavy, suffocating silence. "Dad," I finally whispered, while he exhaled like I'd just asked for too much. "It's just easier this way, Emma. You know how things have been. Don't make it harder." And just like that, the call ended. The dial tone buzzed in my ear, low and endless, as I stood in my kitchen surrounded by everything I'd prepared for the trip: the pie dish, the gift bags, the unopened bottle of my mother's favorite Chardonnay. That was when it hit me. I wasn't part of we anymore. For a few minutes, I didn't move. My hand trembled slightly as I set the phone down on the counter. Outside, the first snow of November floated down lazily, coating the window ledge in white. I had bought my plane ticket a week ago, booked a rental car, even wrapped a scarf I'd spent hours knitting for my mother. I'd told myself this year would be different, that maybe, just maybe, my father would finally see me as more than the family's disappointment. I should have known better. I sat down on the cold marble counter, feeling the chill seep through my jeans. The kitchen felt too big, too sterile. Everything about my condo screamed success: glass walls, stainless steel appliances, city views, yet in that moment I'd never felt smaller. My reflection in the oven door looked foreign to me. The woman staring back had everything she'd once dreamed of: a thriving business, her own name, on a property deed, independence. But she also had something no amount of money could fix: the ache of being unwanted by her own blood. My mind replayed the last time my father had told me he was proud. It was 2 years ago when I helped him refinance the family home so they wouldn't lose it. I'd spent months negotiating with the bank, cutting through red tape, using my savings to secure the deal. "You saved our home," he'd said then, his hand on my shoulder. "You're a good daughter." I had believed him. But now that same home, worth over $1.2 million, belonged to a family that no longer wanted me around. I grabbed the wine bottle and poured myself a glass, maybe two. The liquid shimmered gold under the pendant light. I tried to swallow the bitterness, but it clung to my throat. Every memory came rushing back: the years of being compared to my brother, the snide remarks about my overambitious career, the way my sister-in-law called me Miss Independent, as if it were an insult. I had worked hard to stay connected, to show up at every holiday, with gifts, with effort, with hope. And still, it was never enough. A small part of me wanted to call back, to demand an explanation, to scream into the phone that I'd done nothing wrong. But the larger part, the part that had learned over years of subtle rejection, told me there was no point. They'd made their choice long before this phone call. I just hadn't wanted to see it. I walked to the living room and stood before the large framed photo from last Thanksgiving. In it, my mother was smiling, my father carving the turkey, my brother raising his glass. I was sitting at the corner of the table, caught mid-laugh, my eyes glancing off camera. That night I had felt like maybe things were healing. I'd baked 3 pies, helped my mother with the decorations, and for a moment we'd felt like a family again. But looking at it now, I saw what I had missed: my brother's arm around his wife, my father leaning toward them, not me. Even in stillness, the picture whispered the truth: I had always been on the outside. The phone buzzed again, a message from my brother, as if to twist the knife deeper. "No hard feelings, sis. Just want to keep things peaceful this year." Peaceful. The word made me laugh out loud. They'd chosen peace over me. I deleted the message without replying. By evening, the city lights glowed beneath the falling snow. I stood at the window, watching the flakes dance in the wind. Somewhere across town, families were gathering, laughing, setting tables. The smell of roasted turkey and pumpkin pie drifted faintly from other apartments. I imagined my father's house, the fire crackling, the same silver candlesticks, my mother's crystal plates. Maybe they'd replaced my seat already. Maybe someone else sat there now pretending to be family. I went to my desk and opened my laptop half to distract myself, half out of habit. Unread emails flooded the screen. Clients' partners' bank notifications. One subject line caught my eye: property ownership confirmation. I clicked it open. It was a reminder of the joint deed on my parents' house, showing both my father's and my name. For a second, my stomach tightened. That house had been the one tie left between us, a symbol of everything I'd done to keep them safe. And now it was the last string I could pull to cut them loose. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. My father's voice replayed in my head. We all agreed. The words echoed, slicing through the quiet. Maybe they had agreed to erase me, but I could agree to something too. I could agree to stop bleeding for people who didn't see my worth. On the counter, my phone lit up again. This time, it was my mother's number. I froze. For a heartbeat, I thought maybe she was calling to apologize, to say she didn't mean it, that it was all a misunderstanding. But I let it ring, and finally stop. She didn't leave a voicemail. She never did when things got hard. I poured the last of the wine into my glass and stepped back to the window. Snowflakes pressed softly against the glass, melting into nothing. Down below, people hurried through the street, clutching gifts bundled in scarves, heading toward warmth. I used to think family meant belonging, a place you could always come back to. Tonight I realized it could also mean the people who taught you how to stand alone. I took one long sip and whispered to no one. If they can cut me off, I can do the same. The words felt strange in my mouth, sharp but freeing. For the first time in years, the silence didn't scare me. It felt clean, final. When I turned off the lights, the room sank into a gentle darkness. The only glow came from the city below, distant, indifferent, alive. I watched it until my reflection disappeared into the night. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, I felt the first flicker of something new, not anger, not even grief, but a kind of clarity. This year, the only thing I would be thankful for was finally learning the truth. I woke up the next morning to a kind of stillness that didn't feel peaceful. It felt hollow. My phone sat dark on the nightstand. No new messages, no apology, no come home. The air in my apartment was cool, still carrying the faint smell of the pecan pie I never got to serve. For a few minutes, I just sat there in bed, letting the silence spread until it filled every corner of the room. Then I got up, wrapped myself in a sweater, and made coffee strong enough to burn. I deleted the reminder on my phone that said, "Flight to Aspen, Thanksgiving," and as the screen went blank, a wave of something between grief and relief washed through me. As the steam rose from the mug, my eyes landed on an old photo on the fridge, my brother Ryan and me, both in our 20s, smiling at a summer barbecue. My father had his hand on Ryan's shoulder. Mine was cropped out of the frame. I took the photo down and stared at it, tracing the smudge where my mother's ring light had caught the flash. That's when the memories began to unspool one after another like a film reel I hadn't asked to play. When I was a kid, it had always been Ryan this, Ryan that. Ryan's trophies lined the living room shelves while my spelling bee medals stayed boxed under my bed. Dad called him the family's future. I was the one who helped out. Once when I was 10, I spent an entire afternoon baking cookies for my father's birthday. When I handed him the plate, he smiled politely before turning to Ryan and saying, "Did you remember to mow the lawn? That's my boy." My mother had just kept folding napkins, her silence smooth and practiced. I learned early that being good didn't make me visible. Years later, that same pattern followed me into adulthood. I worked my way through college, juggling 2 jobs, while Ryan dropped out twice. Still, my parents bailed him out every single time. He just needs direction, they'd say, as if the world owed him one. When I landed my first big promotion, I remember telling them over dinner, excited, hoping for pride. My father looked up, nodded once, and said, "That's great, Em. Pass the mashed potatoes." But the day I stopped expecting their approval was the day I started to succeed. By 30, I had built my own real estate company, owned my apartment, and had savings my family didn't even know about. Ironically, the first time my father called me responsible was the day he asked for help. It had been 3 years ago. He called late one evening, his voice shaky. "Emma, your mother and I were in a bit of a situation." Their house, the grand Caldwell home that had stood for decades, was on the verge of being taken by the bank after one of Ryan's business ventures collapsed. He'd convinced my father to refinance to fund his new company, and when it went under, they were left drowning in debt. I remember sitting at my kitchen counter, holding the phone, listening to the panic in my father's voice. "I'll fix it," I told him without thinking, and I did. For weeks, I spent every spare hour negotiating with the bank, reviewing contracts, leveraging my own assets to secure a better loan. When it was done, the house valued at over $1.2 million was safe. My name went on the deed beside my father's part of the legal agreement. He thanked me with a pat on the shoulder and said, "You didn't have to do that." I smiled and replied, "I know." A few days later, they threw a small dinner to celebrate the family staying together. Ryan gave a speech about how lucky we are to have each other. My parents toasted him for his resilience. I sat at the far end of the table, invisible again, watching the man who had nearly bankrupted them get praised for trying. When I left that night, no one even noticed. I sat in my car for half an hour, staring at the lit windows of the house I'd just saved, wondering why gratitude always skipped my seat. Now, years later, I could still hear that laughter, echoing faintly in my mind, as I stood in my apartment, watching the snowdrift outside. I pulled out a box from my closet labeled family. Inside were cards, old photos, and a collection of Mother's Day letters I'd written but never sent. I flipped through one from college. "Dear Mom, I'm doing fine. I wish you'd come visit sometime." Her reply had been 3 sentences long, ending with, "Take care of yourself, honey." I smiled sadly. I had Mom. I had taken care of myself. Maybe that was the problem. When I looked at the box again, I noticed something else tucked between the papers, a copy of the property deed from the bank, still marked joint ownership. I had kept it out of practicality, but now it felt heavier, symbolic. The only thing tethering me to them was a house that had never truly felt like home. I closed the lid and placed the box on a shelf in the storage room. As I turned away, a strange calm settled over me. For the first time, I realized that all those years I'd been paying for their security financially, emotionally, just to buy a place I'd never been allowed to belong. I whispered into the empty room, "You needed me when it mattered. But now that I don't, I'm replaceable." Around noon, I went for a walk. The sidewalks were dusted with frost, and my breath came out in little clouds. Couples passed by holding hands, their laughter spilling into the air. I envied their simplicity. I stopped at a small cafe for tea, watching people greet each other with hugs, shared meals, warmth. It reminded me of how my family only knew togetherness when it benefited them. On my way home, I found myself thinking about my mother. There had been one night long ago when she'd tried to defend me. We were in the kitchen. I was 25 and had just told them about a business expansion. My father had said, "That's great, but don't get too full of yourself." My mother murmured, "Charles, she's doing so well," he'd snapped. "She's too independent for her own good." My mother had lowered her eyes and said nothing more. I remembered how small her voice sounded then, how much like mine it used to be before I learned to quiet it. Now, standing at my window, I whispered, "You chose peace over me." It didn't sound angry, just factual. I wasn't even sure if I blamed her anymore. She'd been taught to survive by silence. I'd just learned to survive differently. That evening, I made dinner for one. I lit a candle the same way my mother always did, but this time the flame was for me. I sat at my small dining table, eating slowly, savoring the stillness. My mind drifted to the future, to a life where my worth wasn't tied to who needed saving. When I finished eating, I opened my laptop and checked work emails, the soft glow of the screen reflecting off the wine glass beside me. For a second, I imagined my father sitting across from me, lecturing me about family loyalty. I could almost hear his voice. "You're so emotional, Emma. You take everything personally." He was right. I did. Because family had been personal. I leaned back and exhaled. Maybe that was my strength, not my flaw. Maybe feeling deeply was how I'd survived in a family that had forgotten how to feel at all. I closed my laptop and looked around the apartment, the faint hum of the heater, the flicker of candlelight, the clean white snow outside. It was quiet, but for once I didn't feel small inside it. I got up, blew out the candle, and turned off the lights. The reflection in the dark window caught me mid-motion, a woman who'd spent a lifetime being useful now learning what it meant to simply exist. Maybe some families don't break all at once, I whispered to my reflection. Maybe they chip away piece by piece until one day you just stop reaching for what's already gone. The city lights glimmered below, distant and alive. I stood there for a while, not crying, not angry, just still. Then I picked up my phone, scrolled through my contacts, and found the group labeled Family. With one quiet motion, I deleted it. My reflection didn't flinch. It smiled. I told myself I was only driving by to clear my head. But when the familiar streets began to appear lined with frosted maples and glowing porch lights, I knew where I was going. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as the Caldwell house came into view. It stood exactly as I remembered, perfect symmetry, white shutters, the porch light glowing soft gold against the falling snow. It was the kind of house people dreamed about. To me, it felt like a monument to everything I'd lost. I parked across the street, leaving the engine running to keep the heat on. The gift box sat on the passenger seat, a bracelet I'd bought for my mother weeks ago, engraved with the words, "For all the dinners we'll still share." The irony stung now. I stared at the house for a long minute before whispering, maybe they didn't mean it. Maybe it was just one bad conversation. I killed the engine, stepped out, and started walking up the driveway, my breath turning white in the cold air. The closer I got, the more I could see inside through the frosted windows. The dining room glowed warm and golden. My father sat at the head of the table carving a turkey, while my brother Ryan poured wine into crystal glasses. My mother moved back and forth between the kitchen and the table, her hair pinned neatly, her face lit with a smile I hadn't seen in years. For a moment I froze on the walkway. The house radiated warmth, laughter, belonging, everything I wanted but had never truly received. I took a breath and pressed the doorbell. The chime echoed faintly inside. Through the window I saw my mother glance toward the door, her smile faltering. But before she could move, someone else appeared, Lydia, my sister-in-law. She opened the door halfway, her expression polite but tight. "Oh, Emma, this is unexpected." I forced a smile. "Hi, Lydia. I just wanted to drop something off for Mom. A small gift." She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder. I heard muffled voices behind her, Ryan saying something I couldn't make out. Then Lydia stepped outside, pulling the door slightly closed behind her so the warmth stayed in, and I stayed out. "It's not a good time," she said, her tone clipped like a manager addressing an unwanted guest. "It'll just take a second," I replied, holding up the small box. "I won't come in." Her eyes darted past me toward the street. "Emma, the family's tired. It's been a long week." Inside, I saw movement. My father's figure appeared briefly in the hallway, his silhouette framed by candlelight. He paused, saw me, then turned away. My mother stood still at the kitchen door, hands clutching a dish towel. She didn't move either. Something in me cracked quietly then, not loud, not dramatic. Just a small sound inside that told me the last thread had snapped. "Of course," I said finally. "Wouldn't want to disturb anyone's peace." I placed the box on the doormat, my fingers numb from the cold. Lydia nodded awkwardly. "Thank you. I'll make sure she gets it." I managed a polite smile. "Tell her I said Happy Thanksgiving." As I turned to leave, I heard her close the door softly behind me. Not a slam, just the quiet finality of someone making sure you knew you didn't belong. The wind stung my cheeks as I walked down the driveway. The snow was starting to fall harder now, tiny flakes sticking to my coat and hair. Across the street, Mrs. Henderson, the elderly neighbor who'd known our family since I was little, stood at her mailbox in a heavy coat. "Emma," she called out, squinting through the falling snow. "You're not staying for dinner." I forced a smile that hurt. "Just dropping something off, Mrs. Henderson." She looked past me at the house, her brow creasing. "Shame. Your mother always said Thanksgiving wasn't complete without both her children." I nodded, pretending not to notice how my throat tightened. "People change." Her face softened. "You take care, dear." I waved and walked back to my car. The lights from the house glowed behind me, laughter faint through the windows. It sounded muffled like music playing underwater, beautiful but unreachable. When I opened my car door, I hesitated before getting in. Through the glass, I saw my mother standing at the window. She had drawn the curtain halfway aside, her face barely visible. Our eyes met for a fleeting second. I raised a hand slightly, a small wave. She didn't wave back. Her hand twitched, then she let the curtain fall shut. That single movement hurt more than every word they'd ever said to me. I sat there for a while, engine idling, my breath fogging the windshield. The little gift box sat on the porch, dusted with snow. I thought of how many times I'd stood on that same doorstep, waiting to be invited and believing it would be different. It never was. When I finally pulled out of the driveway, my chest felt heavy, my hands cold on the wheel. The streetlights blurred through the snow, their glow soft and distant. I didn't play any music. I didn't cry either. The silence felt like its own kind of funeral. As I drove through town, I passed other houses, each window glowing with families gathered around tables, their laughter spilling out into the night. I imagined the smell of roasted turkey, the sound of clinking glasses, the easy rhythm of belonging. In the passenger seat, the pecan pie I'd baked the night before slid slightly with each turn. My mother's favorite. The sight of it made my stomach twist. At the next red light, I glanced out the window and saw a man sitting on the corner, bundled in layers, holding a cardboard sign that said "Hungry. Anything helps." Without thinking, I pulled over, rolled down the window, and held out the pie. He looked startled. "Are you sure?" "Yes," I said quietly. "I made it for someone who doesn't need it." He smiled, eyes kind but tired. "Thank you. You're the first person to stop today." His words hit harder than he knew. "You're welcome," I said, then drove away before my voice could break. By the time I reached home, the snow had thickened, blanketing the streets in white. I parked, turned off the engine, and sat there in the dark for a long time. My hands rested on the steering wheel, still trembling faintly. I could still see my mother's face in the window, her hesitation, her silence. It wasn't hatred, it was fear, the kind that made people choose comfort over courage. Inside my apartment, the air was cold and quiet. I hung my coat, poured a glass of water, and stared at my reflection in the kitchen window. My face looked tired, older somehow. There was sadness there, but also something else, resolve. "They didn't have to shout to make me feel small," I whispered. "They just had to pretend I wasn't there." I turned off the lights and stood in the dim glow from the city outside. For a moment, I imagined the house again, warm, full of laughter. Then I imagined the gift box still sitting on the porch, slowly disappearing under the snow. It was almost poetic. I'd left something behind for them, and now the snow was burying it, just like I was learning to bury the need for their love. I took a deep breath and let it out slowly. The ache in my chest was still there, but it felt quieter, cleaner. "They shut me out of their home," I said softly to the empty room. "They don't know yet I'm about to shut them out of mine." Outside, the snow kept falling. The city shimmered under it, quiet and endless. Inside, I wrapped myself in a blanket and sat by the window until the first hint of dawn appeared, pale and uncertain. By morning, the pie plate would be empty somewhere across town in hands that needed it more. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like the one left hungry. The apartment was too quiet that night. The kind of quiet that presses against your chest until breathing feels like a decision. The table was set for a single plate, one fork, one glass of wine. The smell of takeout Chinese filled the room, sharp and salty, nothing like the slow warmth of roasted turkey that used to float through my parents' house every November. The candle flickered weakly beside my plate, its flame bending as if it too was tired of standing alone. I picked up my phone and opened social media. My brother Ryan's post sat at the top of my feed, a perfectly filtered photo of my family's Thanksgiving table. The gold-rimmed plates gleamed under chandelier light, my father carving the turkey like a scene from a magazine spread. My mother's smile was wide, her hand resting on Ryan's shoulder. The caption read family. Always. The words sliced through me. I zoomed in on the photo until it blurred, until the edges melted into nothing. I waited for anger, but what came instead was emptiness, a hollow space where love used to live. I set the phone down, took a sip of wine, and stared at the candle. Its small light trembled, stretching shadows across the walls. I could almost hear the sounds that used to fill Thanksgiving nights, the clink of forks, the hum of my father's jazz, records the warmth of my mother's laughter before it faded into polite silence. Now the only sound was the city wind slipping through the cracks of my windows. Last year during Thanksgiving, my father had raised his glass and said, "This family stays strong because we stick together." I remembered that line clearly. I had believed it back then. Now with my phone glowing beside me, I laughed softly and whispered together, "As long as I'm paying for it." The laugh didn't last. It cracked somewhere halfway through. I put my fork down and rubbed my temples, the wine burning in my throat. Never again, I whispered. To distract myself, I reopened my phone, scrolling absent-mindedly. That's when I saw another update, my father's comment under Ryan's photo. Proud of my son for keeping our family strong this year. He hadn't mentioned me. Not even once. Something inside me broke cleanly this time. Not loud, not messy, just final. I turned the phone face down and stared at the table. The candle's flame danced taller as if it knew something had shifted. I reached across the table and blew it out. The smoke curled up in thin gray ribbons, twisting before disappearing. The darkness felt good, honest. Then, out of habit, I opened my laptop. Work emails glowed across the screen, reminders of deadlines, property listings, contracts, all the parts of my life that actually worked. And there it was, sitting quietly in my inbox, the message from my attorney ownership deed, confirmation of joint title. I clicked it open. The document stared back at me, clear and clean. My name right below my father's, still listed as co-owner of the $1.2 million Caldwell home. I leaned back in my chair, staring at those two names. My fingers hovered over the trackpad, trembling slightly. My sadness started to turn cold, dense like ice forming under skin. That house, I murmured to myself, half mine. I read through the lines again, remembering the day I'd signed them, believing I was saving something sacred. Believing that if I helped, they'd finally see me as family, not a mistake that needed correcting. My breath came slow and steady now. The anger was gone. What replaced it was clarity. If they can erase me from their table, I whispered, I can erase myself from their deed. I stood up and crossed the room. In the corner sat a small box of old family keepsakes, the ones I hadn't thrown away yet. I pulled it open. Inside were photos, birthday cards, a few notes from my mother's handwriting, and one framed picture of my father teaching Ryan how to ride a bike. I turned it over. On the back, in my mother's careful script, it read, "Our boys." The words stung. Not because they excluded me, but because I'd once wanted so badly to belong inside them. I held the frame above the candle wick and struck a match. The tiny flame hissed, then grew steady. I touched it to the corner of the photo. The paper curled, slowly blackening around the edges. The faces melted first, the smile, the grass, the summer sky, until all that was left was ash. I dropped it into the empty sink, watching it cool. It didn't feel cruel. It felt like a funeral that was long overdue. I stayed there for a while, staring at the ashes. Then I turned off the lights, letting the darkness settle again. My phone buzzed once, just once. My mother's name on the screen. I froze, staring at it. Maybe she was calling to apologize. Maybe she was calling because she felt guilty. The phone kept buzzing. I didn't answer. After a few seconds, it stopped. No voicemail followed. She never left one when things got hard. I picked up my glass and walked to the window. Outside, snow was falling again, thick and slow, blanketing the streets below. The world looked peaceful, quiet, almost new. I pressed my hand to the glass and whispered, "If peace costs this much, I'll still pay it." The reflection of the city lights shimmered over my skin, and for the first time I didn't see a woman waiting to be loved. I saw someone learning how to love herself. I sat back down at the table, opened my laptop again, and scrolled through the property records. My cursor hovered over the line with my father's name. I didn't have to do anything yet, just knowing I could was enough. Revenge didn't feel like rage. It felt like silence. Clean, cold, absolute. I stared at the deed one last time, then closed the laptop. My phone lit up again, a notification from social media, a photo of Ryan and his family by the fireplace captioned, "So thankful for all we have." I smiled, just a faint, weary curve of my lips. "You'll see what you have soon enough," I murmured. The heater clicked softly in the corner, breaking the silence for a moment before falling quiet again. I could hear the faint hum of the city, the heartbeat of something alive and distant. I took another sip of wine, colder now, and exhaled. The bitterness had faded. What remained was steel. "Tomorrow," I said to the empty room. "Tomorrow I start cutting ties." The candle smoke had already vanished, but its scent still lingered, a trace of something burned clean. I stood by the window once more, watching the snow collect on rooftops. It looked almost gentle, like forgiveness falling over a city that had forgotten how to ask for it. "They always said family is forever," I whispered. Maybe that's true. Because even forever has to end somewhere. When I finally turned off the last light, the room glowed faintly from the city below. My reflection in the glass was soft, half-shadowed, almost new. By morning, I would know what had to be done. And this time, I wouldn't hesitate. The morning light poured through the blinds, slicing across my kitchen counter like quiet determination. The air smelled of fresh coffee and frost. I stood there barefoot, watching the steam rise from my mug, feeling more awake than I had in months. There were no tears, left no hesitation, only a strange kind of calm, the kind that comes when you finally stop waiting for someone else to fix what they broke. I put on a charcoal blazer, brushed my hair back, and stared at my reflection. My eyes were clearer, colder, but not cruel. "No more tears," I said softly to the woman in the mirror. She didn't flinch. She just nodded back. I grabbed my folder labeled Family Trust, Property and Allowance, and slid it into my bag. Then, I picked up my car keys and stepped into the cold Denver morning. The drive downtown was quiet. The snow had begun to melt, leaving streaks of silver water across the streets. People bustled past, wrapped in scarves, carrying coffee cups, laughing into phones. I used to envy people like that, untouched by betrayal, still believing family meant safety. Now I just felt older. When I arrived at my lawyer's office, the receptionist looked up and smiled politely. "Miss Caldwell, Mr. Langford, will see you now." Mr. Langford had been my attorney for years, a calm, gray-haired man with eyes that always looked like they already knew the ending. He gestured for me to sit. "Emma, I wasn't expecting to see you this soon. Everything all right?" "Yes," I said, setting the folder on his desk. "I need to remove my name from the Caldwell property deed." He blinked. "The house in Aspen, that's quite valuable. Are you sure you want to do that completely?" He studied me for a moment. "Usually people fight to stay on property titles, not erase themselves from them." "I'm not most people," I replied. He gave a small nod, pulling out the necessary forms. "It'll take a signature and some verification. But once this is done, you'll forfeit all ownership and legal rights to that house. You'll be cutting all ties financially." "Perfect," I said, picking up the pen. That's the point. He hesitated before handing me the document. Emma, forgive me if this sounds personal, but are you sure this isn't a decision made in anger? I looked up at him. If it were anger, I'd have done this years ago. He didn't ask again. The pen glided across the page, my signature steady and deliberate. Each loop of ink felt like a small liberation. When I finished, I set the pen down and exhaled. It wasn't triumph, I felt it was silence. The kind that fills the space where obligation used to live. Mr. Langford placed the papers into a folder. All right, I'll process these by tomorrow. He paused. You're a good daughter, Emma. Not everyone would have saved their parents' home in the first place. I smiled faintly. Maybe that was the problem. Back in the car, the city lights reflected off the windshield blurry through the last flakes of snow. I sat for a while before starting the engine, letting the heater hum softly. Then I opened my banking app on my phone. There it was, the recurring transfer I'd set up years ago, $8,000 monthly allowance to Charles and Margaret Caldwell. It had started as a gesture of love, a way to help them feel secure, but over time it became a leash I tied around my own neck. I stared at the screen. The numbers meant less to me than the habit they represented, how much I'd been paying just to keep my family's approval. I hesitated for a breath, then tapped cancel recurring payment. The screen blinked, then displayed payment deactivated successfully. A small smile crept across my face, not gloating, just peaceful. It's strange, I whispered, how silence can be louder than screaming. I made a note in my financial log, cut off, November 28. The date looked clean, almost elegant on the page, like a period at the end of a long, exhausting sentence. On the drive home, my mind drifted to the day it had all begun, the first phone call from my father asking for help. I could still hear his voice, shaky, full of fake humility. Your mother's not well, Emma. We could use some help until Ryan gets things sorted. I hadn't even thought twice. I'd transferred the money before he finished explaining. I'd told myself it was love. It was really fear of being forgotten again. Over the years, the requests had grown quieter but more constant. Little hints, the taxes are higher this year. Your mother needs new medication. We'll pay you back when Ryan's business turns around. They never did. But I kept paying anyway because I couldn't stand the silence that came when I didn't. Now, sitting at a red light, I realized the silence I'd once feared had become my greatest weapon. At the next corner, I pulled into the downtown bank. Inside, the marble floors gleamed like water. A young clerk with kind eyes greeted me at the counter. Her name tag read Maya. Hi, Miss Caldwell. What can I help you with? Today I need to update my account settings, I said, and terminate any linked family accounts permanently. Maya hesitated. All of them. All of them. As she typed, she glanced up, hesitant. Are you sure? It looks like some of these transfers go to dependents, possibly your parents. I met her gaze evenly. They're not dependent on me anymore. They're just used to being rescued. Her eyes softened and a faint smile tugged at her lips. Understood. I'll handle it. When she was done, she handed me a receipt confirming the closures. You're all set. It must feel strange, though, letting go of that much control. I folded the receipt neatly and slid it into my coat pocket. Not strange, I said. Freeing. As I walked out of the bank, the wind hit my face sharp and clean. The sky above was a deep, cold blue streaked with white. For the first time in years, I felt light. Driving home, I thought about how people always imagine revenge as something fiery, dramatic, a shout, a slammed door, a storm. But mine was quiet. No yelling, no chaos. Just doors closing one after another until all that was left was peace. When I got back to my apartment, the air felt warmer somehow. I set my keys on the counter, poured myself a cup of tea instead of wine, and opened my laptop. My inbox was full of work messages, contracts, meetings, deadlines. It all felt steady, reliable mine. I clicked open a blank document and typed 3 words at the top, what freedom feels like. Then I leaned back and smiled. The phone on the counter buzzed once, then again. I didn't check it. I knew who it was. Probably Ryan, maybe my father. Or maybe they'd started to notice the missing deposits. Either way, it didn't matter. They'll think it's a glitch at first, I murmured to myself. Then they'll call the bank. Then they'll realize the truth. I closed the laptop. For the first time in years, I didn't feel guilty for choosing myself. The sun had begun to set, casting long orange ribbons across the apartment walls. I stood at the window looking out at the glowing city. The world kept moving indifferent to everything I'd just done. It felt right that way. I picked up my tea, let the warmth fill my hands, and whispered, "They took my invitation. I took back my power." Outside, the last snowflakes drifted through the fading light, catching fire as they fell. The city looked softer now, cleaner. I watched until the colors faded to dusk, until the lights began to sparkle again, tiny signs of life I no longer needed to chase. This wasn't revenge anymore. It was reclamation. And for the first time, I finally belonged to myself. The first thing I noticed that morning was the silence. Not the hollow, aching kind that used to haunt me, but something gentler, steady, clean, almost alive. The sunlight filtered through my blinds, touching the edge of my desk where yesterday's paperwork still lay. I stretched slowly, realizing for the first time in years that my body didn't feel heavy. It felt like my lungs had finally remembered how to breathe. I made coffee, humming to myself as the kettle whistled. The city outside was just waking up, the air crisp, the streets slick with melted snow. I checked the clock on the wall, 7:30. My new beginning was exactly 1 week old. Work felt different now. I drove to the office early, the heater humming softly as I watched the skyline rise against the morning Sunday. No calls from my father, no messages from my mother, no reminders of how much I owed them financially or emotionally. My phone, once filled with family notifications, had been blissfully quiet. When I parked, my assistant Lauren greeted me with her usual smile. "Morning, Emma. You look lighter." I smiled back. "I am." She nodded approvingly. "Good. You deserve it." It was such a simple sentence, but it stayed with me all day. You deserve it. I'd spent my whole life earning approval that never came. Now the idea that peace didn't need to be earned, it just had to be chosen, felt revolutionary. By noon, my inbox was stacked with contracts, deals, property inquiries. It was the kind of chaos I thrived on. Still, when my phone buzzed, I felt that familiar jolt in my chest. I glanced at the screen. An email. The subject line read, "Urgent account inquiry." It was from my father's accountant. I opened it, scanning the short, polite message. "Mr. Caldwell has noticed some recent changes to joint financial arrangements. Could you please confirm if these were authorized by you?" I didn't reply. I deleted it. A few minutes later, my voicemail pinged. I pressed play. A bank manager's voice came through the speaker. "Miss Caldwell, we've received multiple calls about an issue with your monthly deposits. We'll need to verify." I hit stop. My reflection in the black screen of my phone smiled faintly. Let them figure it out. It wasn't bitterness. It was clarity. That evening, I drove home through soft flurries of snow. The streets glowed in the fading orange light. My phone buzzed again, texts from unknown numbers, messages I didn't bother opening. I turned the device face down on the passenger seat. Silence was a kind of music now, one I never wanted to stop hearing. On Saturday morning, I went to yoga for the first time in months. The studio smelled faintly of lavender and cedarwood. When the instructor asked us to close our eyes and breathe, I did. "Inhale what strengthens you," she said. "Exhale what doesn't." I pictured my father's voice, his dismissive tone, the constant weight of proving myself. I let it all go on the exhale. During the meditation, she said one more thing. "When you stop reacting, you start reclaiming." The words lodged somewhere deep inside me. That was it. My silence wasn't avoidance, it was reclamation. After class, I walked home through the city, feeling a strange, quiet happiness settle inside me. The bakery on the corner had its door open, the smell of cinnamon rolling out into the street. A couple laughed softly as they shared a croissant. An old man fed crumbs to pigeons by the fountain. It all felt beautifully ordinary. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I didn't look. At home I made lunch and played soft music. The apartment was filled with light. Then, just as I sat down, a new message flashed on my laptop screen, an alert from my voicemail inbox. I pressed play without thinking. My father's voice filled the room, rough and strained. "Emma, we need to talk. Your mother's upset. You can't just ignore us like this." The house, I stopped it there. He still didn't get it. It was never about the house. It was about the years I'd begged to be seen and heard, and how easily they'd dismissed me once I stopped giving. I shut the laptop and stepped onto the balcony. The air was cold but clear. Denver stretched beneath me, a city moving forward, whether anyone was ready or not. By Monday, the silence between us had turned into a kind of quiet storm. A text from a cousin popped up. "Hey, your parents are trying to reach you. Everything okay?" Another, from an old neighbor. "Heard there's trouble with the house. Hope you're all right." I ignored them all. Then came a message from Ryan. "Did you mess with the accounts? Dad's losing it. Fix this before it gets worse." I almost laughed. He still talked to me like I was an employee, not a sister. I deleted his message and blocked the number. The next day, during a lunch break, I wandered through a small farmer's market near my office. The air was filled with the sound of vendors calling out the smell of roasted nuts and apples. I bought a bundle of lilies, white, delicate, unpretentious, flowers for myself just because. As I paid, the cashier looked up with a curious smile. It was Maya, the same young woman from the bank. "Oh, Miss Caldwell, how are you?" "I'm good," I said. "Really good," she grinned. "You don't look like someone who regrets her choices." "I don't," I said. "Not one bit." She handed me the flowers and said quietly, "Then you did the right thing." Her words followed me home. I put the lilies in a vase on my dining table and stood back to admire them. They made the room smell like renewal. Later that evening, an unexpected email appeared in my inbox, this one accidentally copied to me. It was from my father to his lawyer. Subject: urgent. Mortgage payment default notice. I read the first few lines. The panic, the confusion, the shifting blame. I didn't need to read more. I closed the email and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. It wasn't joy I felt. It was justice. The kind of justice that comes not from revenge but from finally letting someone live with the consequences they've created. The phone rang again that night. My mother's name. I stared at it, my thumb hovering over the green button. For a split second, I thought about answering, about hearing her voice, about ending the quiet. Then I imagined the moment after the guilt, the manipulation, the slow unraveling of everything I'd worked to reclaim. I let it ring. When the call ended, I turned off the ringer completely. The silence returned soft and protective. I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window watching the snow fall. The world outside looked peaceful, silver and white under the streetlights. I thought about what my father had once said. "You're too sensitive, Emma. You take everything personally." He was wrong. I didn't take everything personally. I just stopped pretending the things that hurt me didn't matter. I sipped my tea, feeling the warmth spread through me. "They think silence means weakness," I whispered. "They don't know it's the only language I have left." The phone screen lit up one more time, glowing faintly against the dark table. "Dad." I reached over and turned it face down. Outside, the snow had stopped, leaving the world washed clean. Inside, I breathed deeply and listened to the quiet, the kind that no longer hurt. I wasn't waiting anymore. I wasn't reacting. I was reclaiming. And this time the silence was mine. The phone started buzzing before dawn. At first I thought it was an alarm I'd forgotten to turn off, but when I rolled over, the screen lit up in the dark, 32 missed calls. My father, my mother, Ryan. Even the home number I hadn't seen in years. The ringing started again, relentless, each vibration echoing through the apartment like a reminder of everything I'd cut loose. I stared at the screen for a long moment, the sound drilling into the silence I'd spent a week protecting. Then I turned it over and set it face down on the nightstand. The buzzing continued, muffled, desperate, until it stopped. I got up, made coffee, and watched the sunrise through the window. The sky glowed pale orange over the Denver skyline, quiet and distant. My mug warmed my hands, grounding me. When the phone started again, I let it ring. The noise no longer made me flinch. It just confirmed what I already knew: my silence was working. When I finally picked up the phone to check, the counter had jumped to 62 missed calls. One voicemail icon blinked red. I pressed play, curiosity winning out over patience. My father's voice filled the room, firm but strained. "Emma, it's your father. We need to talk. The bank called about the accounts, and this isn't funny. You can't just disappear like this." His tone was clipped, commanding not a hint of remorse, just irritation that he couldn't control me anymore. I stopped the message halfway through and deleted it. A few minutes later, another voicemail downloaded automatically. My mother this time, her voice trembling. "Sweetheart, your father's just upset. Please call us back. We can fix this before it gets worse." Before it gets worse, as if the damage hadn't been done long ago. I could almost picture her clutching the phone with shaking hands, whispering apologies she didn't mean. I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling that familiar pull of guilt, and then I let it go. I deleted her message too. The next one was Ryan. His voice was sharp, impatient. "Emma, what the hell did you do?" Dad's furious, mom's crying, and now the bank's frozen the line of credit. "You need to grow up and fix this." I laughed quietly. "No, Ryan," I said into the air. "You need to." Then I blocked his number. By the time I left for work, the total had hit 80 missed calls. By afternoon, it reached 102. 102 missed calls. The number stared back at me like an accusation, but instead of shame, I felt something close to satisfaction. I took a screenshot and saved it, not as proof for them, but for myself. A reminder that silence has power too. At the office, my assistant poked her head in. "Everything all right? Your phone's been buzzing nonstop." I smiled. Everything's perfect. The truth was, I didn't feel perfect. I felt raw. My stomach twisted each time I thought about my mother's voice, the panic in it. But beneath that, there was relief, clean, undeniable relief. After years of begging to be heard, they were finally the ones desperate to speak. Around noon, I stepped outside for some air. The cold wind stung my face as I walked along the sidewalk, hands shoved into my coat pockets. Cars rolled past, people hurried by, all of them wrapped in their own lives. No one would have guessed I was dismantling mine piece by piece, and somehow it felt like freedom. When I got back to my desk, a new email had arrived from an old family friend, Margaret Harris. "Your dad's been trying to reach you. Please call him back, dear. He sounds awful." I closed the message without responding. They'd used pity before. This time I wasn't falling for it. That evening I came home to a quiet apartment. I cooked dinner, something simple, pasta and a glass of red wine, and turned on some music. But even over the melody, I could hear my phone buzzing on the counter. I didn't touch it. I just let it keep vibrating until it stopped. Hours later, I sat on the couch watching the city lights flicker outside the window. The air felt thick with unsaid words. For a second, I thought about calling my mother back, about ending the silence. Then I remembered her standing at that window weeks ago, curtain in hand, watching me leave without saying a word. She had chosen silence first. Now she could live with mine. I turned off the lights and sat in the dark, listening to the hum of the heater. My mind wandered back to when I was little, when my father taught me to ride a bike. I'd fallen once, scraping my knee. He'd said, "Don't cry, Emma. Be tough. You can't let people see you weak." Back then I thought strength meant pretending I wasn't hurt. Now I understood it was something else entirely, learning when to walk away. I must have drifted off on the couch because when I woke, the phone was buzzing again. This time it was nearly midnight. I picked it up half out of habit and stared at the screen. Dad again. Then Ryan. Then Mom. Call after call, like waves crashing against a rock that wouldn't move. Finally, I played one last voicemail. My father's voice sounded different, lower, almost panicked. Emma, your mother's not well. She's been crying all day. Please just call back so we can talk. We'll fix this, I promise. I held the phone to my ear, listening to the pauses between his words, the cracks, the things he didn't say. For a moment, my chest tightened. Then I realized he wasn't calling because he missed me. He was calling because he'd lost control. I put the phone down gently and whispered, "You can't fix what you never valued." The apartment was silent again. I walked into the kitchen, refilled my glass, and stared at my reflection in the window. My face looked tired but calm, strong in a way I hadn't recognized before. The next day I met Nora for lunch at a small cafe near the park. She studied me over her cup of tea. "Are you really not going to answer them?" "No," I said simply. She frowned. "You don't think this is too harsh?" I shook my head. "They didn't answer me for years, Nora. I'm just returning the favor." Her expression softened. "Be careful not to become what you hate." Her words lingered long after I left the cafe. That night, I dreamed I was sitting at my family's Thanksgiving table again. Everyone was there, my father carving the turkey, my mother smiling, Ryan talking too loudly. I tried to speak, but no sound came out. My father looked at me and said, "You're too quiet, Emma." I woke up with tears on my pillow. Silence had become my weapon, but it was also my mirror, showing me just how lonely justice could be. By morning, the calls had stopped. I stared at my phone for a long time, waiting for it to light up again. It didn't. I poured myself a cup of coffee, the silence stretching thick and still. When the screen finally buzzed, it was my mother's number. I didn't answer. I watched it ring, fade, and ring again. When it stopped, I whispered to the quiet room. They didn't listen when I begged. Now they can listen to my absence. I turned off my phone completely and placed it face down on the counter. Outside, the snow had begun to melt, the world softening under the first light of morning. I stood by the window, breathing deeply, feeling both the ache and the relief of everything I'd done. Their panic was noise. My peace was silence. And for the first time in my life, I chose the sound that belonged to me. The silence lasted 3 days. No calls, no messages, no emails. I thought maybe they'd finally given up, but deep down I knew better. With my family, calm was never peace. It was the pause before another storm. On the 4th morning, I opened my laptop and found an email waiting for me from my cousin Lisa. The subject line read, "Just so you know." My stomach sank before I even clicked. Her message was short. "I thought you should hear it from me. Your parents are in trouble with the bank. The house might be at risk. I'm sorry." I sat there staring at the screen, the words blurring slightly as I read them again. For a moment I couldn't feel anything. Then slowly a familiar ache crept into my chest. Not sympathy, not regret, just the ghost of the daughter. I used to be the one who would have rushed to fix everything. I closed the laptop and pressed my palms against the table, grounding myself. "You did this once," I whispered. "You don't have to do it again." But curiosity, that old enemy, wouldn't leave me alone. I opened my email again and typed a message to my lawyer asking if he could verify anything about my parents' situation. His reply came within the hour. "They've fallen behind on mortgage payments. The bank has issued a notice. You're no longer legally tied to the property, so you're not responsible." I exhaled slowly. The words should have comforted me, but instead they felt heavy. That house wasn't just a building, it was a symbol. It had always represented everything I tried to hold together, and now it was crumbling without me. Later that afternoon, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Emma." The voice was hesitant. It was Mrs. Henderson, the neighbor who'd seen me leave their house weeks ago. "Hi, Mrs. Henderson. I don't mean to intrude, dear," she began softly, "but your parents have been asking everyone about you. They seem worried. I think they're in over their heads." Her voice wavered, gentle with pity. "Your mother looked awful the last time I saw her. She asked if you'd call." I closed my eyes, pressing my fingers to my forehead. "Thank you for letting me know," I said, "but I can't go back there." There was a pause. I understand, sweetheart. Sometimes love just hurts too much. When I hung up, I sat on the couch, the city humming faintly outside my windows. My mind drifted back to the last time I'd walked through that house, the warmth of the fireplace, the faint scent of pine polish, the sound of my mother humming as she set the table. It used to feel like safety. Now it only felt like history. That evening I called my lawyer again. Mr. Langford, could you tell me who the deed was transferred to after I signed it over? He rustled some papers on the other end. Looks like your parents added your brother's name a few weeks later. He's listed as co-owner now. Ryan, yes. Why? I let out a quiet laugh. No reason. Of course. They hadn't just excluded me from their table, they'd tried to erase me from their legacy too. After we hung up, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat by the window staring out at the lights. My reflection stared back, calm, steady, but with something sharp behind the eyes. They didn't just push me away, I murmured. They built a life where I didn't exist. The thought didn't make me angry anymore. It just made me certain. Around midnight, the phone rang again. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered anyway. Emma. My father's voice sounded hoarse, older. I said nothing. Emma, please. I know you're there. We need to talk. Still I stayed quiet. The bank called, he continued. They're saying the payments haven't gone through. We're trying to fix it, but... His voice trailed off raw and small in a way I'd never heard before. I don't know what happened. I almost pitied him. Almost. Finally I spoke. You happened, Dad? There was silence. Then softly. You don't understand. I understand perfectly, I interrupted. You said I wasn't family. You made that decision for me. Now you get to live with it. Emma, he said, the sound barely a whisper. Please, I ended the call. For a long time I sat there in the dark listening to the quiet hum of the city below. It should have felt victorious, but it didn't. It just felt necessary. The next morning my phone buzzed with another message, this one, from the family's old lawyer, the one who'd handled my father's business deals years ago. I thought you should know it read your parents may lose the house if they can't find additional income. They mentioned you, but I told them legally your involvement ended last month. I stared at the message, my throat tight. For years that house had been my proof of worth. I'd poured money, time, and effort into saving it, saving them. And when I stopped, everything unraveled in weeks. It was never about love. It was about dependence. Later that afternoon I met Nora at a coffee shop. She studied my face as I stirred my drink. You look exhausted, she said. I am. Have you heard from them? I nodded. They're losing the house. Nora's brows lifted slightly. And how do you feel about that? I thought about it for a moment, then said, like it's finally fair. She gave me a long, thoughtful look. Sometimes fairness and peace don't live in the same house, you know. I'm not looking for peace, I said. Not yet. That night I dreamed of the Caldwell home again, only this time it wasn't filled with laughter. The walls were cracked, the chandeliers dim, the fire cold. My father sat in his chair, staring at empty plates, while my mother stood by the window holding the curtain just like she did that night. Only this time she looked at me and whispered, "We shouldn't have closed the door." I woke up before dawn, tears drying on my cheeks. The dream stayed with me all morning, lingering like a bruise. Around noon, my father called again. I didn't answer. Instead, I opened my email and sent a single line to Mr. Langford. Please confirm the final status of the Caldwell property once it's settled. He replied within minutes. Of course, Emma, I'll handle it. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair, the weight of everything pressing and lifting at the same time. They had wanted a life without me. Now they had it. Still, part of me, small and stubborn, ached for something I couldn't name. Maybe it was closure. Maybe it was the sound of my mother's voice saying she was sorry. But I knew better than to expect that. As evening fell, I stood by the window watching the first flakes of snow begin to fall again. The world outside looked soft, new, untouched. They had their house, their choices, their silence, and I had mine. I whispered into the fading light, "You didn't lose the house because of me. You lost it because you forgot who built it." The city below flickered to life, and I stood there until the last bit of sun disappeared behind the mountains. In the end, I didn't feel like the villain. I didn't even feel like the victim. I just felt free. The knock on my office door came just after noon. I was reviewing a contract when Lauren buzzed through the intercom. "Emma, there are 2 people here asking for you. They say they're your parents." For a moment, I couldn't speak. My throat closed, and I stared at the stack of papers in front of me until the words blurred. "Send them in," I said finally. My voice didn't sound like mine, it was steadier. The door opened, and my parents stepped inside. My mother looked smaller than I remembered, her hair pulled back tightly, her coat buttoned wrong. My father, on the other hand, stood straight, his expression a mix of anger and pride. He didn't waste time on greetings. "We need to talk," he said, his tone clipped. I gestured toward the 2 chairs across from my desk. "Then talk." They sat down, the tension filling every inch of the room. My mother's hands twisted in her lap. My father leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "The bank's threatening foreclosure," he said flatly. "You can't just walk away from family responsibilities like this." "Family responsibilities," I repeated, the words sharp in my mouth. "You mean the house I saved once already? The house you told me I wasn't part of anymore?" My father's jaw tightened. "You're being dramatic. That Thanksgiving thing was a misunderstanding." I let out a laugh that didn't sound like laughter. "A misunderstanding? You told me not to come. You said everyone agreed I wasn't invited." He shifted uncomfortably. "That was poor wording." My mother reached out, her voice soft. "Emma, please. We didn't mean for things to go this far." I looked at her hand's delicate, trembling ring glinting under the fluorescent light. "You watched me walk away," I said. "You could have stopped it. You could have opened the door." Her voice cracked. "I was scared of losing your father. I felt something twist inside me, and you lost me instead." For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the heating vent. My father exhaled sharply, standing up to pace. "We're not here to argue about the past," he said. "We're here to fix this." I folded my hands on the desk. "There's nothing to fix. I gave you everything once. You spent it." He turned, his face red. "You think this makes you the bigger person? You think cutting off your own parents makes you noble?" I stayed seated, my voice calm. "No, it just makes me done." His eyes flashed. "Don't talk to me like I'm some stranger." "That's exactly what you are," I said quietly. "A man who values money more than his daughter." He froze. My mother started to cry. Her sobs filled the room, soft at first, then louder. It was the kind of crying that comes from years of pretending everything is fine. I stood and went to the cabinet behind me, pulling out a folder. I placed it on the desk between us and opened it. Inside were copies of the deed documents, my name once beside my father's, then the form I'd signed to remove it. "This," I said, tapping the page, "is what independence looks like. You wanted me out of your lives. I made it official." My father stared at the papers, his eyes dark. "You're punishing us." "No," I said. "I'm freeing myself." He looked down at the document again, the realization settling over him. My mother wiped her eyes, whispering, "We were wrong." I shook my head. "You were selfish, and I was stupid enough to keep paying for it." My father's voice broke the anger, draining away, replaced by something smaller, shame maybe. "You've become cold," he said. I met his eyes. "No, I've become clear." He looked at me for a long time, and in that silence, something passed between us, a quiet acknowledgement that the power had shifted. The roles had reversed. The daughter who once begged for love now held all the control. Finally, he gathered the papers into his hand, straightened his coat, and said, "We'll manage." "I hope you do," I replied. He walked to the door without looking back. My mother hesitated, standing in the doorway. Her eyes were red and tired. She reached out and touched my arm gently. "I never stopped loving you, Emma." I believe that I said softly. "But love without respect isn't enough." Her hand trembled, then fell away. She followed my father out, closing the door quietly behind her. When they were gone, I stood in the center of my office, the silence pressing in like fog. My heart beat fast, but my hands were steady. For the first time in my life, I had said everything that needed to be said. I poured myself a glass of water, sat back in my chair, and stared at the window. The city stretched out below, cold, bright, and indifferent. It looked exactly how I felt. For years, I thought closure would come with an apology. But now I realized closure came from truth. From standing still while the people who hurt you faced what they'd done. When Lauren poked her head in a few minutes later, she glanced at me curiously. "Everything okay? Everything's finally okay," I said. After she left, I leaned back and closed my eyes. The sound of my mother's sobs lingered in my ears, but so did her words. "I never stopped loving you." I wanted to believe her. Maybe part of me still did. But love had never been the problem. Love had always been the weapon. I stood and walked to the window, pressing my hand against the cold glass. Outside, the sky was pale, gray flakes of snow beginning to fall again. Somewhere, across town, the house I'd saved once was now slipping away brick by brick, payment by payment. They had built their world without me. Now they'd have to live in it without my help. The thought didn't bring joy, but it brought peace, and peace was something I hadn't felt in years. When my phone buzzed, I ignored it. I already knew who it was. Instead, I opened my journal, the same one I'd kept since college, and wrote, "I didn't walk away to hurt them. I walked away to stop hurting myself." The words sat there on the page, quiet and final. I closed the book and looked around my office at the walls, the light, the desk where I'd built my own life from nothing. I realized I wasn't angry anymore. I was free. Outside, the snow fell thicker, softening the city's edges. I watched it for a long time until the world seemed to blur into white. When I finally turned off the lights and gathered my coat, the office was dark, except for the faint reflection of my face in the glass, calm, steady, alive. Sometimes I thought freedom doesn't come with fireworks. It comes with a door closing quietly behind you. And I let that sound follow me all the way home. The morning after the confrontation felt different. The air was clearer, the silence softer. For the first time in months, I didn't wake to the weight of dread pressing against my chest. I lay still for a while, letting the sunlight creep across the sheets, feeling its warmth on my skin. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was peace in its earliest form. I got out of bed, slowly moving through the apartment like someone learning how to live again. The kettle whistled, the smell of coffee filled the kitchen, and when I looked out the window, the city glowed under a new layer of snow. Denver had never felt so still. I thought of how yesterday my father's voice had cracked, how my mother's hand had trembled when she touched my arm. The memory didn't sting. It just settled somewhere quiet inside me. When I sat down with my coffee, I didn't open my emails or check my phone. I just watched the sunlight shift across the walls. For years I said softly to the room I thought peace would come when they changed. I was wrong. It came when I stopped waiting. That thought stayed with me all morning. Guilt came and went like shadows on the floor, flickering but never staying long. The truth was part of me did miss them. Or maybe not them, but the idea of them. The family I wanted, not the one I had. I'd spent years fighting to prove I belonged, but belonging built on pain was never real. Around noon, I put on my coat and stepped outside. The air was crisp, biting against my cheeks, but it felt good to be out. I walked aimlessly through the city, passing small shops with wreaths in the windows and couples holding hands. I stopped at a florist's cart near Union Station and picked out a single red candle from the display. The vendor wrapped it carefully in tissue paper, smiling as he handed it over. "For someone special?" he asked. "For me," I said. He nodded like he understood. I carried the candle home and set it on the counter. The color glowed even in the daylight, a deep, steady crimson. It reminded me of warmth, of courage, of the kind of love that didn't vanish when it wasn't returned. Later that day, I met Nora for coffee. The cafe was quiet. the smell of roasted beans and cinnamon comforting in a way that felt familiar. She smiled as I walked in, but her eyes searched my face. So she said softly, "How did it go?" "It went the way it had to," I said, sitting across from her. "Did they finally listen?" I nodded. For the first time, yes. But not because they wanted to, because they had no choice. She leaned forward, concern flickering in her eyes. "Do you feel better?" I thought for a moment, stirring the foam in my cup. "Better doesn't mean happy," I said. "But it means I can breathe." She smiled faintly. "That's something." "It's everything," I replied. We talked for a while about work, about holidays, about anything but the past. But before we left, Nora reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You didn't burn bridges, Emma," she said. "You just stopped walking one way." The words hit something deep in me. That night I couldn't stop replaying them. After dinner, I found myself driving without really deciding where to go. The roads were slick with melting snow, the city lights shimmering in puddles. Before I knew it, I was in the old neighborhood. My parents' street looked smaller, narrower than I remembered. The house sat at the end of it, the porch light still on, though one of the bulbs flickered weakly. I parked across the street and sat for a long time. The house that once felt larger than life now looked tired, almost fragile. I could see the faint outline of curtains in the living room window. I didn't know if they were home. I didn't need to. A crooked "for sale" sign leaned in the yard, half buried in snow. The wind nudged it back and forth with a slow, eerie rhythm. I should have felt vindicated, but instead, all I felt was calm. "Houses can be sold," I whispered. "Peace has to be built." I didn't get out of the car. I just sat there, letting the silence stretch between the past and me, like a bridge I didn't need to cross. Then I turned the key, drove away, and didn't look back. When I got home, a small envelope waited on the floor by my door. No postage. Hand-delivered. My name written in shaky cursive across the front. I knew that handwriting. I took it to the table and opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "Emma, I don't know how to undo what we did. Your father won't say it, but he's ashamed. I am too. Please know I never stopped loving you, I just didn't know how to show it. I hope someday you can forgive us, even if we never deserve it. I miss you every day. Love, Mom." The words blurred for a second as tears filled my eyes. I hadn't expected to cry, but something about seeing her handwriting, hearing her voice between the lines, cracked open a part of me I thought I'd buried. I read it twice, then folded it gently and set it in the top drawer of my desk. I wasn't ready to respond, not yet, but I didn't throw it away. That was its own kind of forgiveness. I lit the red candle and placed it on the table. The flame flickered steady and alive, casting soft gold light across the room. I sat down and watched it for a while, the wax melting slowly, the air smelling faintly of smoke and cinnamon. "You can't control who breaks you," I whispered. "But you can decide what grows in the cracks." I made myself a simple dinner music playing quietly in the background. For the first time in a long time, it didn't feel strange to eat alone. It felt intentional. Later, I opened my journal and began to write. I used to measure love by apologies. Now I measure it by how I sleep at night. I paused, then added one last line. They may never change, but I already have. When I closed the book, the candle was still burning, the flame low and calm. I turned off the lights, leaving only that small glow behind. The shadows on the wall danced softly, like the rhythm of a life finally settling into itself. I stood there for a long time, letting the warmth wash over me, the ache in my chest, softening into something that almost felt like gratitude. Forgiveness didn't have to mean returning. Sometimes it was just releasing the weight and walking forward. As I crawled into bed, the faint scent of smoke lingered in the air. It didn't smell like loss anymore. It smelled like freedom. And for the first time in years, I fell asleep without dreams. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window, spilling across the counter where the smell of cinnamon and baked apples filled the air. I hummed softly to myself. As I laid out the last dish on the table, a roasted turkey smaller than the ones from my childhood, but perfect for the 6 people who would sit around it today. The warmth from the oven mixed with the sound of faint laughter drifting from the living room, where Nora and Maya were arguing about who had brought the better pie. For the first time in years, Thanksgiving didn't feel like an obligation. It felt like a choice. My choice. I paused for a moment, hands resting on the edge of the counter, and looked around the little dining room. It wasn't fancy, no marble floors or crystal chandeliers, no spotless tablecloth ironed to perfection. The plates didn't match the candles leaned slightly, and the flowers I'd arranged the night before had already begun to droop. But there was a kind of beauty in the imperfection. This, I whispered to myself, feels right. A soft knock came from behind me. Need any help? I turned to find Nora leaning against the doorway holding a bottle of wine and a grin. You already helped enough, I said. You made me buy real napkins this time. She laughed, setting the bottle on the table. And it looks great, cozy, like it's supposed to. The doorbell rang before I could respond. I wiped my hands and went to answer it. Maya stood there bundled in a red scarf holding a casserole dish that smelled like heaven. I brought the sweet potatoes, she said, her cheeks pink from the cold. And I might have gone overboard on the marshmallows. Perfect, I said, taking the dish from her. The sweeter the better. Behind her came 2 of my coworkers, both carrying desserts and smiling like this was the event of the year. It kind of was, for me at least. As everyone gathered around the table, I took a deep breath, feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time: belonging. Not the kind I'd spent my life trying to earn, but the kind that grew naturally without demands or conditions. When we all sat down, Nora raised her glass. To new traditions, she said. To family, Maya added softly, her eyes meeting mine. I smiled, lifting my glass. To the family we choose. The clinking of glasses filled the air, followed by laughter, conversation, and the kind of easy warmth that used to feel impossible. Between bites of food, I caught myself glancing toward the window, half expecting to see the ghost of my old life looking back. But all I saw was the reflection of the candlelight flickering across faces that had become familiar, safe. At one point, Nora leaned over and whispered, "You're quiet." "I'm just grateful," I said. "Good," she replied, squeezing my hand. "You deserve that." As the evening went on, stories filled the room: bad cooking mishaps, embarrassing family memories, tales of heartbreak and recovery. Each one somehow circled back to the same quiet truth: we'd all been broken before, and we'd all learned how to build ourselves again. When the plates were cleared and dessert was served, I noticed my phone buzzing on the counter. I hesitated, but curiosity made me stand and pick it up. One new message. It was from my mother. "We're thinking of you today. Your father wanted me to say, Happy Thanksgiving." I stared at the words for a long time. My hand trembled slightly, but not from anger this time. There was no apology, no explanation, just a single sentence that sounded like the closest thing to peace they could offer. I placed the phone back on the counter without replying. Not yet, maybe not ever. But as I returned to the table, I felt something inside me soften. I smiled faintly. "Happy Thanksgiving to you too," I whispered under my breath. Later, when the laughter had quieted and the dishes were piled high in the sink, I stood alone for a moment, looking at the aftermath of joy, the crumbs, the empty glasses, the melted wax from the red candle burning low in the center of the table. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. I turned off the lights except for the candle. The flame glowed softly against the dark window, reflecting back at me. I thought of the woman I'd been a year ago, sitting in an apartment alone, uninvited and unwanted. I thought of how far that version of me had come, how she'd turned her pain into boundaries and her boundaries into peace. I picked up the candle and carried it to the porch. Outside, the night was cold and the first flakes of snow were beginning to fall. The street was quiet except for the faint sound of wind. I placed the candle on the railing and watched it flicker in the darkness. "Thank you," I whispered, not sure who I was saying it to. Maybe the universe, maybe myself, maybe even them. for teaching me how to be alone so I could learn how to belong. Behind me, the sound of laughter spilled through the open door, Nora teasing Maya, someone calling for another slice of pie, the kind of laughter that carried warmth through the chill. I turned back to them, my heart steady, my hands no longer shaking. Inside, the candlelight cast long golden shadows across the walls, catching the edges of the mismatched plates and the smiles of the people who had stayed. I stepped back into that light, closing the door behind me as the snow fell heavier outside. Later that night, when everyone had gone and the apartment was quiet again, I sat at the table with a cup of tea, staring at the candle's final glow. It burned low, the wax almost gone, but it refused to die out completely. I picked up my journal and wrote, "I spent years chasing their love. Now I understand that peace was waiting for me all along." I set the pen down and exhaled. The flame wavered one last time before it disappeared into a thin thread of smoke. The room went dark, but the warmth lingered, soft, invisible, alive. Outside, the snow covered the city in white silence. Inside, for the first time in my life, I was home. It was a quiet Sunday morning when I finally realized how light my heart had become. The snow outside had melted into thin streaks of silver, and the trees in front of my building were bare, fragile, and beautiful in their honesty. I made tea and sat by the window the same way I used to sit there months ago, only now there was no ache pressing behind my ribs. Just stillness, just peace. The world felt slower now. The need to explain myself, to chase answers, to be seen, it was gone. In its place was something stronger. Not forgiveness, not exactly, but understanding. Sometimes people don't love you the way you need them to. Sometimes they never learn how. But you can still love yourself enough to stop waiting. A soft knock broke the silence. Nora peeked her head in, holding a small paper bag. "Don't tell me you're skipping breakfast again," she said with that mock stern tone she used when she worried about me. I smiled. "Come in, the tea's hot." She joined me at the table, her hair loose and cheeks flushed from the cold. She handed me the bag. Inside were 2 croissants. "Peace offering," she said. "Did we fight?" "Not yet," she teased. "But I'm making sure we never do." We ate quietly for a while, watching the sunlight pour into the room. "You seem different," she said finally. "I am," lighter she added. "Like you stopped holding your breath." I nodded. "Because I did." She smiled softly. "I'm proud of you, you know." Those words hit deeper than she probably realized. For years, I'd waited for someone in my family to say them. I never thought I'd hear them from a friend, but maybe that's what family really was. Not the people who share your name, but the ones who share your heart when you've run out of pieces to give. After she left, I walked over to my bookshelf and pulled out my journal. The red candle from Thanksgiving sat beside it, burned down to a stub, but still fragrant with cinnamon and wax. I lit it again, watching the small flame come alive. Its glow painted the walls gold. I opened the journal and flipped to a blank page. For a long time, I didn't write anything. Then, slowly, the words began to flow. This year, I learned that closure doesn't always come with apologies. It comes when you stop waiting for them. I learned that boundaries don't mean cruelty, they mean self-respect. And I learned that sometimes walking away is the most loving thing you can do for yourself and for them. I paused, tapping the pen against the paper. I'm not angry anymore. I'm grateful. Grateful that they taught me what love isn't, so I could finally recognize what it is. I closed the journal, the faint scent of ink mixing with candle smoke. Outside, the world was bright, quiet, endless. My phone buzzed once on the table. I hesitated before picking it up. A text from my mother. "I saw the for sale sign come down today. The house finally sold. It's strange not living there anymore. I hope you're well." I read it twice, then smiled. The words didn't make me cry this time. The house was gone, but the weight that came with it was gone too. I typed back, "I'm good, Mom. I hope you are too." Then I hit send. No overthinking, no what-ifs, just peace. Later that afternoon, I went for a walk. The air was crisp, the sidewalks wet from melting snow. The city was full of small, ordinary sounds, the rhythm of footsteps, a bus engine in the distance, a child's laughter echoing from the park. I slipped my hands into my coat pockets and just listened. For so long I'd been afraid of silence. It used to mean absence, rejection, pain. Now it meant something else. It meant freedom. It meant room to breathe. When I reached the bridge that overlooked the frozen river, I stopped for a moment. The sunlight glinted off the water, turning it into 1,000 tiny mirrors. I closed my eyes and whispered a quiet thank you, not to anyone in particular, but to life itself, to survival, to starting over. I didn't need revenge anymore. I didn't even need closure. What I had now was something simpler, purer. The ability to wake up each morning and not feel small inside my own skin. The strength to love without fear of losing myself again. As I walked back home, I noticed the world differently, the details I used to overlook. The way the wind tangled through my hair. The smell of bread from the bakery on the corner. The small boy in a red scarf tugging his mother's hand and laughing. Life kept moving, and I was finally ready to move with it. That night, I poured a glass of wine and sat on the balcony wrapped in a blanket. The sky above Denver was scattered with stars, faint but real. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who stood outside her parents' house in the snow, holding a gift she'd never get to give. I thought about how broken she was, how much she wanted to be seen. And then I thought about the woman I'd become, the one who no longer needed permission to shine. I raised my glass toward the stars. To peace, I said quietly. Mine finally. The candle flickered in the window behind me, a soft, steady glow against the dark. If you're still here with me listening to this story, maybe you know a piece of what that feels like, the long road from hurt to healing, the silence that becomes strength. Maybe you've lived your own version of it. And if you have, tell me. Tell me where you are now, how you found your peace, what you had to walk away from to get there. Leave your story in the comments below, because stories like these, they remind us we're not alone. And if this one spoke to you, stay a while. There are more stories coming of strength, of healing, of the kind of revenge that turns into redemption. Because sometimes all it takes is one story to remind us that no matter how much we lose, we can still find our way home again. The candle burned low, its light softening, until only the faintest trace of smoke curled through the air. And in that fading glow, I smiled. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning.